Hi, welcome back to another Morpher Devlog episode. This week has been a huge week. I've been working on implementing all of the sounds and music into my game, and as you may have noticed, I'm in a new place, and that's because in a couple weeks I'm planning on moving to university. I'll show you the new layout to my studio in a couple weeks once I get that all figured out. Without further ado, let's get into it. So like any aspiring indie entrepreneur, I booted up Freesoundorg and started ripping some Creative Commons assets. Freesoundorg is a really useful asset for indie developers. It's chock full of independently recorded Creative Commons sounds and music. Of course, some of these are under the attribution license, which still can be used in commercial products. You just have to credit the author in your work. But regardless, it offers a huge library of just independently recorded sounds that you can use for any projects ranging from music to games to movies. And if you haven't already checked it out, I recommend doing so. So using this, and of course a huge library that I've already built up over the course of 5 years of development, I started throwing in my door sounds and checkpoint sounds. I used a 3D sound feature which Unity offers, which basically just pans sounds left to right depending on their location on the screen, and so you can kind of see this checkpoint siren fading from side to side as I pass by it. One problem I had was I want there to be volume settings that the player can adjust themselves. And so in-game, the sounds update automatically depending on that slider value that's found in the pause menu. A small glitch I ran into was this sort of popping in effect that happens whenever a sound is played, like one of these balloons as they pop, or the buzzsaws as they're destroyed by this laser. And that's just because the audio source volume is initially set to max, and it only afterwards is set to the actual sound volume. And so I just fixed this by setting the initial audio source volume to 0. Here you can check out my laser sound, which has this build up into the beam. Again, most of these sounds are ripped from Creative Commons assets on freesound.org, and I've just sort of overlaid them in Audacity to make them more original sounding and less like just stock assets. I got to work then on the crane sound, and I really wanted the crane arm to have this really beefy industrial sound. I wanted it to feel very hefty as it swung across the screen, and so I played with a couple different pitch settings in the audio source manager until I found one that I liked and added a bit of screen rumble to it. I threw in some UI click sounds just whenever a button is pressed, and then it was on to the actual level design for level 5. Major mechanics that I introduce in level 5 is the sort of what's been dubbed by many playtesters as the peanut butter. Essentially, the player only sticks to it when they're in their rolling mode, and they can jump out of it. And this leads to some cool interactions like wall jumps and ceiling sticks. But first I had to get the mechanic working. There was a small glitch that I ran into when setting the player velocity to 0. The player would still sort of slide down even when stuck to the wall, and this was just because the gravity was set to 1 still. And despite the rigid body of the object being frozen, it would still drift downward. And so I fixed this by setting the gravity to 0, but then I ran into another problem where I forgot to set it back to 1, and the player would sort of fly off whenever they jumped. But getting this all to work, we have the wall jump, and then I went ahead and added some sounds. Now, these platforms at the very beginning of the level are kind of an interesting take on platforms throughout the sector so far. Players, I've noticed, normally like to roll across these and then jump very sparingly, and in this way I sort of force the player to stay in their jumping mode and be a lot more precise in their landing. Then with the wall jump, I encourage the player to jump back and forth between peanut butter sections on either side of the wall. And this is actually inspired by Donkey Kong Country 2. There's a level that introduces this honey that the player can wall jump off of and sort of avoid enemies and obstacles along the way. I introduced 2 new enemies into this level, the fly and later a cannon that sort of shoots these barrels out. So I got to work implementing my original fly sprites and a destroyed fly object that gets spawned in whenever the player runs into it in the rolling mode. There's a bit of offset in the origin of the flapping sprite, and so as it sort of follows the player flapping, it hovers up and down, and I think that's really cool looking. The buzzsaw spins, and it just sort of follows the player back and forth until eventually it gets destroyed. I threw in a destructible ID tag and some particle effects on the destroyed fly object, and this is how it turned out. So these cannons, despite their similarity to the aesthetic of the bullet bill cannons, they're more inspired by these orangutans in Donkey Kong Country. They would roll these barrels down these steep cliffs, and the player would have to skillfully jump over them to avoid being hit. I created a front and back sprite of the cannon to have barrels look like they're rolling through the cannon. I implemented an object pooling system, and it sort of cycles through a set number of barrels, and if it runs out for any reason, it just spawns another one within the object pool until it can just cycle through all of them with no problem. I slowed down the final speed of the barrels, added some extra red tint to them to really make them pop out, and made the cannons destructible. Now the crux of this level is inspired by Donkey Kong Country yet again. In the factory zone, there are these rail levels where the player has to follow a track. They sort of play off of this mechanic in a couple different ways, with like collecting fuel and just avoiding enemies while staying on this track, and I wanted to play around with that with my peanut butter sticking mechanic. So I made this crate that follows this piping throughout the end of the level, and it has peanut butter underneath, which the player can stick to. The player has to stick to this crate in order to clear these large gaps that they can't jump over, but in between, there are buzzsaws and enemies that force the player to drop off and sort of run through obstacles to quickly catch up before the next gap. With pretty much all of level 5 laid out and finished, I went back through my entire game and just worked on making sure there were no audio glitches or errors in other parts of the levels, and really smoothing out the gameplay at this point. Since Morpher has always encouraged a fast mode of gameplay, I really wanted to work on the flow and the smoothness of each level. It should be very intuitive where the player should go, and there shouldn't be any lulls or bottlenecks in the speed of game. And so playing through these levels, it just really helped me iron those things out and to get the gameplay to feel really fluid. I threw in a timer, which is the third type of challenge that will be throughout all of my levels to get stars. I have collecting stars, which I introduced in the 3rd level, a death mechanic, which I introduced in the 4th level, and finally this timer mechanic. Then the player has to beat certain times in order to achieve star tiers, which again are in the pause screen, and the player can pause at any time to see those tiers. This week has been a huge week. I've gotten a ton done. I was really putting off working on the sounds and implementing music because that was just such a huge undertaking, but now that I've gotten that finished, I can move on to the next level, and this is the ultimate challenge. It's the boss level of the sector. It is the culmination of all of these mechanics coming together in one final challenge. It'll be really fun. I'm really looking forward to next week, so make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, and I'll see you all next week.